The academy stood in the center of the city, tall and proud, with wide glass windows that reflected the afternoon sun. People passing by often slowed down just to look at it. Inside those walls, music was not just taught, it was demanded. The halls were always filled with the sound of pianos, violins, and voices warming up. Every student who walked through the doors carried a dream, and every teacher carried high expectations. Among the teachers was an accomplished pianist whose name was known far beyond the city. Concert posters with his face still hung in the main lobby. Visitors often whispered when they saw him walking down the hallway. He had performed in famous concert halls around the world and had won awards that most musicians only dreamed about. His playing was powerful, sharp, and precise, but his personality was just as strong. He believed that only pressure could create greatness. Students both admired and feared him. When he entered a room, conversations stopped. When he listened, no one dared to make careless mistakes. He was known for pointing out every flaw, every weak note, every hesitation. Some students improved quickly under his guidance. Others quietly gave up. At the start of the new term, a new student joined the academy. She came from a small neighborhood far from the city's bright lights. Her clothes were simple. Her voice was soft. She did not arrive with a proud family name or expensive instruments. She carried only a worn music folder and a quiet determination in her eyes. She had earned a partial scholarship after sending in a recording of herself playing on an old upright piano. The recording was not perfect. The sound quality was rough, and a few notes were slightly out of tune. But there was something about her playing that caught the attention of the admissions panel. It was not just technical skill. It was feeling. Still, once she arrived at the academy, she quickly understood that things would not be easy. Many students had been training since early childhood with private teachers and grand pianos in their living rooms. They spoke confidently about competitions, international workshops, and summer programs abroad. She mostly listened. Her assigned instructor was the accomplished pianist himself. On the first day of his masterclass, the room was full. Students sat in a half circle around a shining black grand piano placed in the center of the stage. Parents and a few guests filled the back rows. These masterclasses were open sessions where one student would perform, and the teacher would give detailed feedback in front of everyone. The new student chose a piece she had practiced carefully for weeks. It was challenging but appropriate for her level. She had prepared every phrase, every pause. When her turn came, she walked to the piano with careful steps. She could feel the eyes of the room on her back. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the bench. She began to play. The first section went smoothly. The melody flowed gently. A few minor slips happened, but she recovered quickly. She focused on the sound, on the story within the music, trying to forget the audience. When she finished, there was polite applause. The accomplished pianist did not clap. He leaned back in his chair, studying her. The room grew quiet. He stood slowly and walked toward the piano. His footsteps echoed across the wooden floor. He asked her to repeat a short passage. She did. He pointed out small weaknesses, uneven timing, a softer note that should have been stronger, a phrase that lacked confidence. His voice was calm but firm. Then he turned to the class and said that talent alone was not enough. He spoke about discipline, about courage, about pushing beyond comfort. He looked at her again. Without warning, he placed a thick stack of sheet music on the piano stand. The title printed at the top was well known among advanced pianists. It was one of the most difficult pieces in the classical world. Fast runs, wide leaps, complicated rhythms. Even experienced performers approached it with caution. A quiet wave moved through the room. Some students exchanged glances. They knew how demanding that piece was. He told her she would perform this piece at the end-of-term recital in 6 weeks. For a moment, she thought she had misheard him. 6 weeks. The piece usually required months, sometimes years, of preparation. Her heart pounded so loudly she wondered if others could hear it. She looked at the pages. The notes seemed endless, almost overwhelming. He asked her if she was afraid. She paused, then answered softly that she was willing to try. A few students lowered their eyes. Some felt sorry for her. Others were curious to see what would happen. It felt less like an opportunity and more like a test. He nodded once and told her that excuses would not be accepted. The masterclass continued, but her mind stayed fixed on the sheet music in front of her. After the session ended, she carefully gathered the pages and placed them into her folder. Her hands were still shaking. As she walked down the hallway, she could hear whispers behind her. That piece is impossible. She won't survive the middle section. Why would he assign that to her? She did not respond. She kept walking. Outside, the city noise felt louder than usual. Buses passed. People hurried along the sidewalks. Life continued as if nothing important had happened. But for her, everything had changed. At home, her apartment was small and quiet. The old upright piano stood against the living room wall. One of the keys stuck slightly, and the pedals squeaked. She placed the sheet music on the stand and stared at it for a long time. She could have refused. She could have asked for a different piece. No one would have blamed her. But deep inside, something stronger than fear was growing. She remembered the first time she had touched a piano as a child. It had been in a community center. The sound had felt like magic under her fingers. Since then, music had become her safe place, her voice when words were not enough. Now, the challenge in front of her felt like a wall, high and intimidating. She sat down and played the first few measures slowly. The notes stumbled. The rhythm broke. It sounded messy and heavy. She stopped, took a deep breath, started again. This time, she focused on one small section, just 4 measures. She repeated them again and again until her fingers remembered the movement. The sun set outside the window, but she kept playing. Over the next few days, she created a simple routine. School in the morning, practice in the afternoon, more practice at night. She broke the piece into smaller parts, learning them like pieces of a puzzle. Some sections made her frustrated. Her hands felt too small for the wide leaps. Her wrists ached from the fast passages. There were moments when doubt whispered in her ear. What if he was trying to prove she did not belong? What if everyone was waiting to see her fail? But each time those thoughts appeared, she answered them the only way she knew how, by sitting back down at the piano. One evening, after hours of practice, she managed to play an entire page without stopping. It was not perfect, but it was progress. She smiled quietly to herself. At the academy, the accomplished pianist watched her during weekly lessons. He noticed the dark circles under her eyes. He heard the improvement in her touch. Still, his expression remained unreadable. He corrected her sharply when she rushed. He stopped her when her dynamics were not clear. He rarely offered praise, but he also listened more carefully than before. As the days passed, something began to change. Not in the piece, but in her. The fear that had filled her chest on the first day slowly turned into focus. The notes that once looked impossible started to make sense. She began to understand the emotion behind the fast runs and dramatic chords. It was not just about speed or accuracy. It was about telling a story of struggle and strength. And without realizing it, she was beginning to shape that story in her own way. 6 weeks still felt short. The recital date moved closer on the calendar. But instead of counting the days with panic, she now counted the improvements. Smoother transitions, clearer phrasing, stronger endings. The accomplished pianist believed he had given her a mountain to climb. What he did not yet know was that she had already started climbing. The days after the challenge felt heavier than before. At the academy, nothing had changed on the surface. Students still hurried through the halls with sheet music pressed against their chests. The sound of scales and arpeggios still floated through the practice rooms. Teachers still walked with serious faces, listening carefully to every note that echoed from behind closed doors. But for her, everything felt different. Now when she walked into the building, she could feel eyes on her. Not cruel eyes, not exactly kind either, just curious. Everyone knew about the recital assignment. News traveled quickly in a place where music was the center of life. Some students tried to encourage her. They told her it was brave to accept such a difficult piece. Others asked quietly if she had considered requesting something easier. A few avoided the topic completely, unsure what to say. She answered politely but did not explain much. She did not want to sound afraid. She did not want to sound overconfident either. The truth was simple, she was both. Her practice hours doubled. After regular classes ended, she went straight to an empty practice room. The Academy's grand pianos were smooth and responsive, very different from the old upright piano at home. At first, the difference confused her fingers. The keys felt lighter. The sound carried farther. Small mistakes sounded louder. She started working on the hardest section first, the fast middle passage everyone feared. Her teacher had circled it in red during their lesson. The notes looked like a storm on the page. The first attempt was rough. Her fingers tangled. The rhythm slipped. She stopped after only a few measures. Frustration rose in her chest. She closed her eyes for a moment. Around her, she could hear other students playing confidently in nearby rooms. It made her feel small, but she had made a quiet promise to herself the night she accepted the challenge. She would not give up without giving everything she had. So she slowed the tempo down. Very slow, painfully slow. She practiced each hand separately. Left hand first, then right, over and over. The sound was not beautiful yet. It was mechanical, careful, but each repetition built a small layer of strength. At home, things were not easier. Her apartment walls were thin, and she worried about disturbing neighbors late at night. Still, she practiced whenever she could. Sometimes she pressed the keys softly so the sound would not travel too far. Other times she practiced silently, moving her fingers over the keyboard without pressing down, training her memory. Her family watched quietly. They did not fully understand the technical difficulty of the piece, but they understood effort. They saw her waking up earlier than before. They saw her stretching her hands in the morning. They saw the tiredness in her face and the determination in her eyes. One evening, after a long practice session, she stayed seated at the piano even after the music stopped. Her hands rested on her lap. She felt overwhelmed. What if 6 weeks truly were not enough? What if the accomplished pianist had been right to doubt her? She let the fear sit with her for a moment instead of pushing it away. Felt real, honest. Then she opened the sheet music again, not to play, but to read. She traced the notes with her finger as if they were words in a storybook. Slowly, she began to see patterns. Repeated phrases, rising sequences, emotional shifts. The piece was not random chaos. It had structure. It had logic. The next day at her lesson, she played the first third of the piece from memory. She made mistakes, but she did not stop. She kept going until the final note of that section. The accomplished pianist listened without interruption. His face remained serious, but something in his posture changed. He was no longer leaning back. He was leaning forward. When she finished, he stood and pointed out several technical issues. He corrected her hand position during the wide leaps. He told her to control the dynamics more carefully. He reminded her that speed meant nothing without clarity. She listened carefully, nodding after each comment. Then, unexpectedly, he asked her to play the same section again. This time, she adjusted her posture. She breathed before beginning. The improvement was small but noticeable. He did not praise her, but he did not criticize as sharply either. As the weeks passed, a routine formed between them. She would bring progress. He would demand more. She would go home and refine every detail he mentioned. Outside the academy, life continued with its normal challenges. Public transportation delays, crowded streets, household responsibilities. There were days when her hands felt stiff from exhaustion. Days when she wanted to sleep instead of practice. But something deeper had started to grow inside her. Not just ambition, but belief. She began recording her practice sessions on her phone. At night, she listened back carefully. She noticed where the tempo rushed and where the emotion felt forced. Listening to herself felt strange at first, almost uncomfortable. But it helped. One weekend, she stayed at the academy longer than usual. The building was nearly empty. The quiet halls felt peaceful. She sat alone in the recital hall where the final performance would take place. She placed the sheet music on the grand piano and began playing slowly. Without an audience, without pressure, something shifted. The music felt freer. She allowed herself to feel the dramatic rise in the middle section. She let the softer passages breathe instead of rushing through them. For the first time, she was not thinking about proving anyone wrong. She was thinking about the story inside the music. When she finished, the final note echoed gently in the empty hall. The silence afterward did not feel frightening, felt meaningful. Unbeknownst to her, the accomplished pianist had returned to the building to retrieve some forgotten papers. As he walked past the hall, he heard the sound. He paused outside the door. He did not enter. He simply listened. The playing was not flawless. There were still moments of tension. But there was something else now, depth, intention, a quiet strength. He stayed longer than he planned. Back at home that night, she marked small improvements in her notebook. She had started keeping track of her daily goals. Faster tempo achieved. Cleaner transitions. Stronger left-hand control. The recital date was now only 2 weeks away. Whispers around the academy had shifted slightly. Instead of asking whether she would fail, students were now wondering how she had improved so quickly. A few even asked to watch her practice. She felt shy but allowed them to sit quietly in the back of the room. Their presence made her nervous at first, but she used it as training. If she could play under their watchful eyes, she could survive the recital. One afternoon, during a particularly difficult run of the fastest section, her fingers slipped badly. The mistake was loud and obvious. A couple of students gasped softly. Her face burned. She paused. In the past, she might have apologized or started over immediately. Instead, she took a breath and began again from the same spot, slower, more focused. She repeated it until the passage flowed smoothly. When she finished, the room remained quiet for a second before someone quietly said, "That sounded different, stronger." She did not smile widely, but inside, she felt a small spark of pride. The accomplished pianist continued to observe her carefully in lessons. He increased the expectations. He demanded full runs of the piece without stopping. He asked her to imagine a full audience watching her. During one lesson, she reached the final page and finished without major mistakes. Her breathing was heavy, but she did not collapse in frustration like before. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said something simple. Again. There was no anger in his voice this time, only challenge. She nodded and began once more. As the second run ended, the room felt different. Not lighter, not easier, but charged with possibility. She was no longer just trying to survive the piece. She was beginning to own it. At night, lying in bed, she still felt nervous about the recital. She imagined the bright stage lights, the audience, the silence before the first note. Her heart would beat faster just thinking about it. But along with fear, there was something new, excitement. For the first time since arriving at the academy, she did not feel like an outsider trying to prove she belonged. She felt like a musician preparing to tell her story. And somewhere in the academy, the accomplished pianist was beginning to realize that his challenge might not unfold the way he originally expected. The morning of the recital arrived quietly, almost too quietly for something that had taken weeks of effort and emotion. The sky was pale, and the city felt calm, as if it did not know how important the day was for her. She woke up before her alarm rang. For a few seconds, she lay still, staring at the ceiling, letting reality settle in. This was the day. Her heart began to beat faster, not in panic, but in awareness. Every practice session, every mistake, every correction from her teacher had led to this moment. She moved slowly through her morning routine. She stretched her fingers carefully, one by one, just as she had learned to do. She avoided practicing too much before leaving home. Her hands needed rest, not exhaustion. Instead, she sat quietly at the piano and played only a few soft scales to warm up. The notes felt familiar under her fingers now, like old friends. Her family wished her well before she left. They did not say many words, but their quiet support wrapped around her like a shield. As she stepped outside, the cool air touched her face. She took a deep breath and began walking toward the bus stop. At the academy, the atmosphere felt different from usual. The recital hall doors were open, and staff members moved around arranging chairs and adjusting lights. The polished grand piano stood at the center of the stage, shining under the soft glow of the ceiling lights. It looked both beautiful and intimidating. Students gathered in small groups, whispering about their own performances. Some were reviewing sheet music nervously. Others stared at their hands as if trying to memorize every movement. She greeted a few of them with a small smile and found a quiet corner to sit. She closed her eyes for a moment and imagined the opening notes of her piece. Not the speed, not the difficulty, just the feeling. She reminded herself that the music was more than a test. It was a story she had learned to tell. The accomplished pianist entered the hall with his usual calm expression. He wore a simple dark suit, nothing flashy, but his presence immediately drew attention. Conversations softened when he passed by. He spoke briefly with the event organizers, then took his seat in the front row. He did not look at her directly, but she could feel that he was aware of her. The recital began. One by one, students walked onto the stage and performed their pieces. Applause followed each performance. Some played beautifully. Others made small mistakes but recovered with grace. The audience remained supportive, clapping warmly each time. As the program moved forward, her name appeared closer and closer to the top of the remaining list. Her hands felt slightly cold. She rubbed them together gently. She reminded herself of the long evenings alone in the practice room, the empty hall where she had once played without fear. She had done the work. She had faced the hardest sections again and again. Finally, the announcer called her name. For a brief moment, everything seemed to slow down. She stood up. The walk to the stage felt longer than usual. Each step echoed softly against the wooden floor. She could sense the audience watching her, curious, expectant. When she reached the piano, she adjusted the bench carefully. She placed the sheet music on the stand, though she barely needed to look at it anymore. Her fingers rested lightly on her lap as she took one steady breath. Silence filled the hall. Then she began. The opening notes flowed gently into the room. They were steady and controlled, not rushed. She focused on the sound traveling from her fingertips into the air. The melody rose slowly, carrying emotion without force. At first, she was aware of everything. The lights above her, the presence of the audience, the accomplished pianist sitting in the front row. But as the first section continued, her mind grew quieter. The music demanded attention, and she gave it fully. The transition into the faster passage approached. This was the section that had once felt impossible. Her fingers moved with confidence she had built through repetition. The tempo increased, but it did not feel chaotic. It felt alive. Each note landed clearly. Each leap found its place. Her wrists stayed relaxed, just as she had practiced. A slight ripple of surprise moved through the audience. It was subtle, but it was there. In the front row, the accomplished pianist sat very still. His eyes were fixed on her hands. The middle section, the storm of notes that many feared, arrived. She did not hesitate. Her fingers moved swiftly across the keys, crossing and uncrossing with precision. The difficult rhythms that had once tangled her now flowed naturally. There was intensity in her playing, but not panic. She was not chasing the notes. She was guiding them. For the first time since sitting down, she forgot about proving anything. She was no longer the student trying to meet expectations. She was simply a musician inside the music. A small mistake happened, a single note slightly lighter than intended, but she did not let it shake her. She continued forward without breaking the line of the melody. The audience leaned in. The accomplished pianist's expression changed slightly. His posture shifted. He was no longer observing like a critic searching for flaws. He was listening. As the piece moved toward its emotional peak, she allowed herself to take more space with the sound. The softer passages breathed deeply. The louder chords carried strength but not aggression. Felt balanced. She reached the final page. Her heart beat faster again, but this time it felt like energy, not fear. The last section demanded both power and control. Her hands rose and fell across the keyboard with certainty. The dramatic runs sparkled instead of crashing. The final build grew steadily, like a wave-gathering force. And then, with one strong, clear chord, the piece ended. The final note hung in the air. Silence followed. It was not an awkward silence. It was full, heavy with feeling. She kept her hands on the keys for a second longer, allowing the sound to fade naturally. Then she slowly lifted them and placed them back in her lap. She looked up. For a brief moment, no one moved. In the front row, the accomplished pianist remained completely still. His eyes were fixed on her, but his expression was no longer stern. It was unreadable, almost distant, as if he were processing something unexpected. Then the applause began. At first, it came from one side of the room. Then it spread. Soon the entire hall was filled with clapping. Some people stood. Others exchanged surprised looks. She rose from the bench and bowed politely. Her legs felt slightly weak, but her face remained calm. When she walked off the stage, a few students reached out to squeeze her hand or whisper quiet congratulations. She nodded, still absorbing what had just happened. She did not immediately look toward the accomplished pianist. Back in her seat, she finally allowed herself to breathe fully. Her chest rose and fell slowly. A strange mixture of relief and disbelief washed over her. She had done it. Not perfectly, not without small flaws, but she had faced the mountain and climbed it. On stage, the next performer prepared to play. The recital continued, but the energy in the room felt different now. Something had shifted. In the front row, the accomplished pianist remained thoughtful. His hands were folded, but his mind was clearly elsewhere. He had expected effort. He had expected improvement, but he had not expected transformation. He replayed moments of her performance in his mind, the confidence in the fast passages, the emotional depth in the quieter sections, the way she had recovered from a small mistake without panic. It was not just technical growth. It was artistry. As the recital neared its end, he glanced back once toward where she sat. She was watching the stage respectfully, applauding for others, not drawing attention to herself. He realized that somewhere along the weeks of pressure and practice, she had stopped being the uncertain newcomer. She had become a musician standing on her own strength. And for the first time since giving her that impossible assignment, he felt something he had not expected to feel. He felt unsure, not about her ability, but about his own assumptions. The applause from the recital did not fade quickly. Even after the final performer finished and the audience slowly began to leave the hall, people were still talking about her performance. Some spoke in low voices near the exit. Others gathered in small groups, replaying certain moments with wide eyes. It was not common for a student to take on such a demanding piece, and it was even less common for someone at her level to perform it with such control. She remained seated for a few minutes after everything ended. The noise around her felt distant, almost blurred. Her hands rested quietly in her lap. They no longer trembled. Instead, they felt warm, steady, almost unfamiliar in their calmness. She had imagined this day many times. In some versions, she failed. In others, she barely survived. She had never imagined this quiet confidence that now sat gently in her chest. Across the hall, the accomplished pianist stood and spoke briefly with several guests. His voice sounded measured, polite. From a distance, he looked the same as always, composed, controlled, respected. But inside, his thoughts were far from calm. He had given her the piece as a test. At first, he believed the challenge would reveal her limits. He had seen many talented students come and go. Some arrived with promise but folded under pressure. Others relied too much on natural ability and lacked discipline. He believed difficulty exposed truth. Yet what he had witnessed on stage was not collapse. It was growth. He replayed the middle section in his mind, the part he himself had struggled with when he was younger. He remembered practicing it for months, feeling frustration when his fingers refused to obey. He remembered the sharp criticism from his own teachers. She had played it differently, not perfectly, but with clarity and purpose. The more he thought about it, the more unsettled he felt. Eventually, the hall emptied until only a few students remained. She gathered her sheet music carefully and placed it back into her folder. As she stood to leave, she noticed him walking toward her. Her heartbeat quickened again, but not in the same way as before. This was not the fear of performing. This was the uncertainty of facing his reaction. He stopped a few steps away from her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. He studied her expression as if trying to understand something beyond the music. "You prepared seriously," he said at last. His voice was calm, but there was something softer in it than usual. She nodded. "I tried my best." He looked down briefly at the folder in her hands. "You did more than try." The words were simple, but coming from him, they carried weight. She felt a quiet wave of relief pass through her. Not because she needed praise, but because she needed to know that her effort had been seen. He asked her to come to his studio the next afternoon for a discussion. She agreed. That evening at home, she did not rush to the piano. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself rest. She sat by the window and watched the city lights flicker on one by one. Her body felt tired, but it was the kind of tiredness that follows honest work. Her family asked how it went. She described the applause, the silence before it, the way her hands had felt during the fastest section. She did not exaggerate. She spoke simply, but her eyes carried a brightness that had not been there before. The next day at the academy felt strangely normal. Classes continued. Students practiced. Yet every time she passed someone in the hallway, she noticed subtle changes. A few greeted her with more respect. Others asked how she had stayed calm during the performance. She answered honestly. She had not been calm at first. When the time came for her meeting, she walked toward his studio with steady steps. The door was slightly open. She knocked softly. He invited her in. The room was lined with shelves of music books and framed photographs from past concerts. A grand piano stood near the window. Sunlight streamed in, casting long shadows across the floor. He gestured for her to sit. For a few seconds, he remained silent, as if choosing his words carefully. "I have taught for many years," he began. "I have seen talent. I have seen discipline. I have seen confidence." He paused. "But what I heard yesterday was something else." She listened quietly. He explained that technical skill could be trained. Speed could be developed. Even stage presence could be practiced. But musical depth, the ability to make listeners feel something real, was rare. "You were not just playing notes," he said. "You were shaping them." She felt warmth rise to her cheeks, but she kept her posture steady. Then his tone shifted slightly. "I did not expect that." The admission hung in the air between them. It was not harsh. It was honest. She understood what he meant. He had doubted her. Perhaps not openly, but internally. Instead of feeling offended, she felt something else, clarity. "I did not expect it either," she replied softly. He looked at her, surprised by the response. She explained that when he first gave her the piece, she had been terrified. She had questioned whether she belonged at the academy at all. But the challenge had forced her to discover parts of herself she did not know existed. He listened without interrupting. For years, he had believed that pressure alone created excellence. Now he was beginning to see that belief needed adjustment. Pressure could break someone, but in her case it had revealed strength. He asked her what she had thought about during the performance. She answered truthfully. She had thought about the story inside the music, about struggle turning into power, about moving forward even when unsure. He leaned back in his chair, thoughtful. He realized that somewhere during those 6 weeks, the roles between them had subtly shifted. He had set the challenge, but she had transformed it into something personal, something meaningful. Before she left, he said something unexpected. "There will be another concert next season, a more advanced program. I would like you to prepare for it." Her eyes widened slightly. He continued, "Not because I want to test you, but because I want to hear how far you can go." The difference in tone was clear. This was no longer about proving a point. It was about possibility. As she walked out of his studio, she felt lighter. Not because the journey ahead would be easy, but because it now felt shared rather than imposed. In the weeks that followed, the memory of the recital continued to ripple through the academy. Teachers mentioned it in passing. Students referenced it when discussing difficult repertoire. But the biggest change was quiet. During lessons, the accomplished pianist no longer focused only on flaws. He still demanded precision. He still corrected mistakes. But he also asked questions. What are you trying to say here? Why did you choose that dynamic? How does this phrase connect to the next? He was no longer listening only for errors. He was listening for intention. And each time she sat at the piano, she felt less like someone defending her place and more like someone building her path. The challenge that once felt like a wall had become a doorway. Neither of them spoke openly about the moment he had frozen in the front row, caught between expectation and surprise. But they both remembered it. It marked the exact second when doubt turned into recognition. And from that second forward, nothing at the academy felt quite the same. The days after their conversation in the studio carried a quiet shift that others could sense but not fully understand. Nothing dramatic happened on the surface. There were no public announcements, no grand speeches, no sudden changes in schedule. But inside the practice rooms, inside the lessons, something had softened. She continued her studies as usual, attending classes, practicing scales, learning new pieces. Yet the way she approached the piano felt different now. The difficult recital piece was no longer just a mountain she had climbed. It had become proof that fear could be faced, that doubt could be answered with effort. The accomplished pianist also seemed different in subtle ways. He still expected precision. He still stopped students mid-phrase if the rhythm slipped. But there was a new patience in his corrections. He listened longer before speaking. He allowed silence to sit in the room instead of filling it quickly with criticism. One afternoon, during a group masterclass, he asked her to perform a short section from a new composition she had begun preparing. It was not as dramatic as the recital piece, but it required emotional control and careful phrasing. She walked to the piano without the heavy nervousness she once carried. Her movements were steady. When she began to play, the sound was calm and thoughtful. She shaped each phrase gently, as if speaking through the keys. When she finished, the room remained quiet for a moment. In the past, he would have immediately pointed out imperfections. This time, he asked the class a question. What did you hear? Students shifted in their seats. One mentioned the clarity of the melody. Another spoke about the softness in the middle section. A third commented on how natural the transitions felt. He nodded and then turned to her. You are learning to trust your own interpretation, he said. The words were simple, but they carried deep meaning. Trust had not come easily. It had been built through long evenings, repeated mistakes, and small victories. As weeks passed, invitations began to appear. A local music society invited her to participate in a small concert series. A teacher from another department asked if she would collaborate in a chamber performance. These were not huge opportunities, but they were steps forward. Each invitation reminded her that her recital had not been a single lucky moment. It had opened doors. The accomplished pianist watched this progress carefully. He did not interfere or claim credit. Instead, he observed quietly, sometimes offering advice about repertoire or stage presence. His tone was no longer testing her limits. It was guiding her growth. One evening, he stayed after a lesson and sat alone in his studio. The building was almost empty. Through the thin walls, he could hear distant practice sounds fading as students left for the night. He looked at his own hands resting on the piano keys. For many years, he had measured success through perfection. Awards, reviews, technical mastery. He had believed that weakness must be exposed quickly so it could be corrected just as quickly. But her journey had unsettled that belief. She had not improved because she was afraid of failure. She had improved because she found meaning in the music. That realization stayed with him. The next time she came for a lesson, he asked her to sit beside him instead of at the main piano bench. I want you to teach this section to me, he said. She looked at him, confused. He pointed to a passage from the recital piece that they had both spent weeks refining. Explain how you approached it. Her first reaction was hesitation. He was the master, the accomplished pianist known across cities and countries. What could she possibly teach him? But he waited patiently, so she spoke honestly. She described how she slowed the tempo until every note felt natural, how she practiced hands separately, how she imagined the emotion rising like a wave instead of forcing speed. As she explained, she realized she understood the piece deeply, not just physically but emotionally. He listened carefully, occasionally nodding. Interesting, he said quietly. I approached it differently at your age. There was no competition in his voice, only reflection. That lesson marked another turning point. It was subtle, almost invisible from the outside, but powerful inside the room. Respect had become mutual. Meanwhile, whispers around the academy continued. Some students who once doubted her now asked for advice. A few even admitted they had assumed she would fail when the challenge was first announced. She did not hold resentment. She understood how easy it was to judge from a distance. Instead, she encouraged them to face their own difficult pieces with patience. One afternoon, a younger student approached her after class. The student was struggling with a demanding composition and felt overwhelmed. I don't think I can do it, the student admitted quietly. She recognized that feeling instantly. The tight chest, the heavy doubt. You can, she replied gently, but not all at once. She showed the student how to break the music into small sections, how to slow it down without shame, how to listen carefully instead of rushing towards speed. As she spoke, she realized she was repeating the same methods she had used during her own struggle. Growth had come full circle. Months later, another recital approached. This time, she was not assigned a piece beyond her level as a test. She selected her own repertoire, challenging, but chosen with intention. When she performed, the applause felt different. It was warm, steady, expected. The accomplished pianist sat in the front row once again. But this time, he did not freeze in surprise. He listened with quiet pride. After the performance, he did not wait long before standing to clap. His applause was strong, confident. It was not the applause of a critic impressed by technical skill. It was the applause of a teacher witnessing transformation. Later that evening, as the hall emptied once more, they found themselves standing near the stage. You have changed, he said. She smiled slightly. I think we both have. He did not argue. He understood what she meant. The challenge he had given her had been born from strict belief. But it had taught him something unexpected, that greatness is not forced into existence. It grows when effort meets belief. As the academy lights dimmed and the doors closed for the night, she paused for a moment on the stage. She placed her hand lightly on the piano lid. This instrument had once felt intimidating. Now it felt like an extension of her voice. The accomplished pianist watched from a distance, then turned off the final row of lights. The hall fell into darkness, but neither of them felt uncertain about what lay ahead. The moment when he had frozen after hearing her play was no longer a memory of shock. It had become the beginning of respect. And respect, they both understood now, was far more powerful than fear. Time moved forward, as it always does, but something lasting had been set in motion at the academy. What began as a difficult assignment had quietly reshaped more than one life. Months passed, seasons changed, and new students walked through the same doors she once entered with nervous steps. She was no longer the quiet newcomer trying to prove she belonged. Her presence had become steady, confident, not loud or attention-seeking, but grounded. When she walked through the halls now, she did not feel the weight of curious eyes. She felt part of the place. The accomplished pianist continued teaching, performing occasionally, and guiding advanced students. His reputation remained strong, but those who observed him closely could sense a deeper change. His lessons carried more balance. He still valued discipline, but he asked more about emotion. He still corrected technique, but he encouraged personal interpretation. The memory of the recital never fully disappeared. It became a story often shared among students. The day a difficult piece turned into a defining moment. But for the two people at the center of it, it meant something more personal. One afternoon, Nearly a year after that first challenge, the Academy hosted a special event celebrating young musicians. Alumni, guests, and donors filled the recital hall. Performances were scheduled throughout the evening. She had been invited to close the program. This time, there was no sense of doubt surrounding her name. The audience expected quality. They expected feeling. Backstage, she stood quietly, listening to the performer before her. The familiar rhythm of applause rose and fell. She looked down at her hands. They were calm. She thought back to the night she first opened the impossible sheet music. She remembered the fear, the long hours, the quiet tears of frustration she had wiped away before sitting back at the piano. She smiled softly. The accomplished pianist stood near the side of the stage, reviewing the program. When their eyes met briefly, there was no need for words. A small nod passed between them, carried history. When her name was announced, she walked onto the stage with natural ease. The grand piano waited under the lights, polished and silent. She chose a new piece for this performance. It was complex, layered with shifting emotions, but it was no longer chosen to test her limits. It was chosen because it spoke to her. She sat down, adjusted the bench, and allowed herself one slow breath. The first notes began gently, like a quiet conversation. The hall fell silent almost instantly. There was no rush in her playing. Each phrase unfolded naturally, guided by intention rather than fear. As the piece developed, the emotional range expanded. Strong passages carried power without force. Soft sections felt intimate, almost like whispered thoughts. The accomplished pianist listened from the side of the stage instead of the front row. He watched not only her hands but her posture, her breathing, her connection to the music. There was confidence there but also humility. She was not performing to impress. She was performing to express. Midway through the piece, she encountered a technically demanding section. In the past, such passages had felt like obstacles to survive. Now they felt like tools to shape the story. Her fingers moved with clarity and control, not because she was proving anything, but because she trusted her preparation. The audience responded in the only way they could, with stillness. Deep, attentive stillness. When the final section approached, she allowed the music to grow gradually. The build felt organic, like something rising from within rather than something forced outward. The last chord resonated clearly through the hall. This time, there was no long pause of uncertainty. Applause came quickly, strong and sincere. She stood and bowed, feeling gratitude rather than relief. As she walked off stage, the accomplished pianist met her with a quiet smile. "Well done," he said. 2 simple words. But there was no hidden test behind them. No unspoken challenge. Only acknowledgement. Later that evening, after the hall had emptied and the lights were dimmed, they sat together on the edge of the stage. It was not a formal meeting, just a quiet conversation. "You remember the first piece I assigned you?" he asked. She laughed softly. "I don't think I could ever forget." He nodded. "I believed difficulty would reveal weakness," he admitted. Instead, it revealed strength. She listened carefully. "I was afraid," she said honestly. "But I think I needed to be." He looked thoughtful. "Fear can close doors," he replied. "But sometimes it forces them open." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, reflecting on how far things had come. He then told her something he had not shared before. "When I was your age, a teacher once gave me a piece I was not ready for. I failed publicly. I carried that embarrassment for years. I think part of me believed repeating that pressure would create resilience." She absorbed his words carefully. "Maybe it did," she said gently. "But not in the way you expected." He gave a quiet nod. The conversation did not need to go further. Both understood that growth had happened on both sides. As she prepared to leave the academy that night, she paused at the entrance and looked back down the hallway. The same hallway where she once walked with shaking hands, holding sheet music that felt heavier than it should have. Now, the building no longer felt intimidating. It felt like the place where she discovered her own strength. In the months that followed, she continued performing, learning, and evolving. Opportunities slowly expanded beyond the city. Invitations arrived from neighboring regions. Each new stage brought fresh nerves, but none carried the same fear as that first impossible assignment. The accomplished pianist, too, continued his work with renewed perspective. He still challenged his students, but he watched more carefully for potential rather than limitation. He encouraged them to find personal meaning in the music rather than chasing perfection alone. The story of that first recital remained a quiet reminder inside the academy. Not a story about humiliation, not a story about proving someone wrong, but a story about what happens when expectation meets dedication. Years later, when new students asked her how she overcame stage fear, she did not give complicated advice. She simply said, "Do the work, feel the music, and don't let someone else decide what you are capable of." Those words were not dramatic. They were honest. The accomplished pianist once overheard her giving that advice. He did not interrupt. He only listened, recognizing how much she had grown beyond the nervous student he first challenged. One quiet afternoon, as sunlight streamed again through the studio windows, she played the original difficult piece once more. Not for an audience, not for a test, but for herself. The notes flowed easily now, almost naturally. He stood by the window and listened. This time he did not freeze in surprise. He smiled, because he knew the truth. The hardest piece had never been the music. It had been belief. And together, through challenge and persistence, they had both learned how powerful belief could be.